The most humiliating moment in Yul Brynner's Hollywood career didn't happen on a movie set or during a bad review. It happened at 2:47 a.m. on a starlit Saturday night in Beverly Hills, in Frank Sinatra's living room, in front of 70 of the most powerful people in the entertainment industry. Brynner had just delivered what he thought was the killing blow to Dean Martin's reputation, a cutting, alcohol-fueled monologue about washed-up crooners and yesterday's men. The room had fallen silent, waiting to see how the King of Cool would respond to being called a has-been by the King of Siam. What happened next lasted exactly 15 seconds, but the reverberations would echo through Hollywood for decades, because Yul Brynner was about to learn that some men don't need to raise their voices to destroy you. The Sinatra compound in Beverly Hills sprawled across 3 acres of perfectly manicured paradise, a testament to what happened when talent met ambition and multiplied by ruthless determination. Palm trees swayed in the warm California breeze, their fronds casting dancing shadows across the terraced gardens where fountains gurgled softly and hidden speakers played jazz at just the right volume, loud enough to set the mood, quiet enough to allow conspiracy. The main house was a monument to mid-century modern excess, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that blurred the boundary between inside and outside, between public performance and private revelation. Tonight, Frank's living room had been transformed into the unofficial headquarters of American entertainment. The guest list read like a who's who of 1962 Hollywood royalty, studio heads who could greenlight million-dollar projects with a handshake, directors whose next picture could make or break careers, actresses whose beauty had launched 1,000 magazine covers, and singers whose voices had become the soundtrack of a generation. This wasn't just a party, it was a summit meeting of the cultural aristocracy, a gathering of the gods who shaped what America watched, heard, and dreamed about. The liquor flowed like water at Lord's, premium scotch and vintage champagne serving as social lubricant for conversations that would determine the fate of projects, partnerships, and careers. Cigarette smoke created a hazy atmosphere that softened the harsh edges of ambition and made everyone look more beautiful, more mysterious, more worthy of their legends. The lighting was perfect, warm, and golden, designed to flatter faces that were already works of art and make voices sound richer, more seductive, more important than they had any right to be. At the center of this constellation of stars stood Frank Sinatra himself, the chairman of the board, the man who had assembled this gathering through the sheer force of his personality and the magnetic pull of his success. Frank moved through his domain with the confidence of an emperor in his own palace, making sure glasses stayed full, conversations stayed interesting, and egos stayed satisfied. This was Frank's world, and everyone else was just visiting. Dean Martin occupied his usual position in Frank's inner circle, not quite at the center of attention, but close enough to matter, relaxed enough to seem above it all, charming enough to make everyone feel like they were in the presence of something special. Dean had mastered the art of being simultaneously present and detached, engaged and aloof. He could work a room without seeming to work, could make people feel important without giving away any of his own power. But on this particular night, Dean's usual equilibrium was about to be tested by the most unlikeliest of adversaries. Yul Brynner arrived at Frank's party like a conquering general entering a defeated city. At 42, he was at the absolute peak of his fame and power. The King and I had made him a household name and earned him an Academy Award. The Magnificent Seven had proven he could carry a Western and command respect from the toughest audiences. The 10 Commandments had cast him as a biblical king opposite Charlton Heston and made him one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. Brynner didn't just walk into rooms, he conquered them. His presence was aggressive, demanding, impossible to ignore. The famous shaved head gleamed under the party lights like polished marble. His piercing blue eyes surveyed the gathering with the calculating gaze of a man who saw everyone else as either useful or obstacles. He wore his success like armor, and his ego like a crown that everyone was expected to acknowledge and bow before. What made Brynner particularly dangerous was his complete lack of self-doubt. Unlike most actors who carried hidden insecurities behind their public confidence, Brynner genuinely believed in his own superiority. He saw himself as royalty among peasants, a serious artist surrounded by entertainers, a king among jesters. This absolute certainty in his own greatness made him fearless in social situations, willing to say things that others wouldn't dare, willing to challenge anyone he felt was unworthy of sharing his spotlight. Tonight, Brynner's attention had focused on Dean Martin, with the laser intensity of a predator selecting prey. The conflict had been building all evening like storm clouds gathering on a summer horizon. Brynner had been working the party with his usual imperial swagger, holding court with studio executives, charming producers with stories from his latest film shoots, reminding everyone present of his impressive box office numbers and critical acclaim. But every time he looked across the room, he saw Dean Martin effortlessly commanding attention without even trying, making people laugh without telling jokes, being the center of every conversation without dominating anyone. It ate at Brynner like acid. Here was a man who seemed to succeed without effort, who achieved what Brynner had to fight for every single day. Dean represented everything that frustrated Brynner about Hollywood, the way charm could triumph over craft, the way coolness could matter more than intensity, the way some people could coast on personality, while others had to prove themselves again and again, through sheer force of will. As the night wore on and the alcohol flowed more freely, Brynner's resentment crystallized into something more dangerous, the decision to publicly establish the hierarchy he believed should exist. He was going to put Dean Martin in his place, and he was going to do it in front of everyone who mattered. The confrontation began innocuously enough, around 2:30 a.m., when the party had thinned out to the core group of serious players and dedicated party-goers. Brynner found himself in the same conversational circle as Dean. They were discussing the changing landscape of Hollywood, the new generation of actors, the way television was affecting movie attendance. It was the kind of shop talk that dominated these gatherings, harmless enough on the surface but loaded with subtext about who was rising and who was falling. "The industry's changing," Brynner said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to be heard. "Audiences are getting more sophisticated. They want real performers, not just pretty faces with nice voices." Dean smiled slightly, recognizing the opening shot of what was likely to become something more serious. "Change keeps things interesting," he replied mildly. Brynner's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement or might have been malice. "Indeed, though I suppose some people adapt better than others. Some embrace the challenge of proving themselves. Others rely on past glories and hope nobody notices when the magic starts to fade." The conversation around them began to slow as other guests sensed the shift in atmosphere. Frank Sinatra, across the room chatting with a group of directors, glanced over with the heightened awareness of a man who had survived decades of Hollywood politics by reading every subtle change in social weather. Dean took a sip of his drink, his expression remaining perfectly calm. "Magic's funny thing, Yul. Either you have it or you don't. And if you have it, it doesn't fade, it just gets better with age." Brynner laughed, but there was no warmth in the sound. Perhaps some people confuse nostalgia with relevance. It's easy to mistake being a beloved relic for being a current force in the industry. The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke, visible and toxic. Around the circle, conversations died as guests realized they were witnessing something more than casual party banter. This was a challenge, a direct attack disguised as philosophical discussion. Dean studied Brynner with the calm attention of a man examining an interesting but ultimately harmless insect. "Yul, you seem to have something on your mind. Why don't you just say it?" And that was all the invitation Brynner needed. "You want directness? Fine." Brynner's voice rose slightly, carrying across the room and drawing the attention of every guest present. "The Rat Pack is finished. You're all relics of a simpler time, when audiences were satisfied with surface charm and recycled nightclub acts. The world has moved beyond lounge singers pretending to be movie stars." The room fell completely silent. Even the background music seemed to fade, as every conversation stopped and every eye turned toward the confrontation developing in Frank Sinatra's living room. Brynner wasn't finished. The alcohol and adrenaline had loosened his tongue completely. "Dean, you're a talented man. I'll give you that. But let's be honest about what you are. A crooner who got lucky with a comedy partner and rode that wave as long as it would carry you. Now that Jerry's gone, now that the Rat Pack novelty is wearing thin, what exactly do you have left? A few albums that sound like every other album you've made. Some movie roles that any decent singer could handle." The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. Brynner had identified every one of Dean's potential vulnerabilities: the end of the Martin and Lewis partnership, questions about his acting ability, the suggestion that his success was based on luck rather than talent, and delivered them with surgical accuracy. But Brynner still wasn't finished. He was enjoying the shocked silence, the way every powerful person in the room was hanging on his words, the feeling of having the floor in a way that rarely happened when he was competing with the likes of Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin for attention. "The truth is," Brynner continued, his voice growing more confident with each word, "you represent everything that's holding this industry back. The old boys club mentality, the belief that charm can substitute for craft, the idea that showing up and being pleasant is enough to justify a career. Audiences today want authenticity, they want intensity, they want performers who have something real to offer beyond a nice smile and a smooth voice. Brynner gestured around the room as if calling witnesses. Look around this room, Dean. These are the people who make decisions in this business. They know the difference between real talent and manufactured appeal. They know who's building a lasting legacy and who's just coasting on fading glory. The silence that followed was suffocating. 70 of the most powerful people in Hollywood stood frozen, watching Dean Martin absorb the most public humiliation any of them had ever witnessed. Brynner had just delivered what amounted to a career obituary in front of everyone who mattered in the entertainment industry. Frank Sinatra started to move across the room, his face dark with anger. Nobody attacked a member of his inner circle in his own home, but Dean held up one hand, a barely perceptible gesture that stopped Frank in his tracks. Dean Martin set down his drink with the same casual precision he brought to every movement. He looked at Yul Brynner with the calm attention of a man examining a moderately interesting museum exhibit. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, conversational, almost gentle. "Yul," Dean said, "you're absolutely right about one thing. This room is full of people who know the difference between real talent and manufactured appeal." He paused, letting the words settle. "Which is why they're all wondering the same thing right now. Why is a man who built his entire career playing the same character over and over again, lecturing anyone else about authenticity?" The shift in the room was immediate and electric. What had been shocked silence became focused attention. Dean wasn't defending himself, he was going on the attack. "I mean, let's think about this," Dean continued, his voice never rising above a conversational level. "The King and I, you played a king. The 10 Commandments, you played a pharaoh, which is basically a king. The Magnificent Seven, you played the leader of 7 men, which is, well, that's a king with better clothes." A few people in the room began to smile despite themselves. Dean was dissecting Brynner's career with the precision of a surgeon and the wit of a comedian. "You talk about range, about challenging yourself, about giving audiences something real. But you've been playing the same role for 6 years, the angry bald man who's in charge. The only thing that changes is the costume and the accent." Dean picked up his drink again, taking a small sip before continuing. "You know what takes real skill, Yul? Making it look easy, making people feel comfortable, making room for other people to shine while still holding your own. That's not coasting, that's mastery." The room was completely silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Where before there had been shock and embarrassment, now there was anticipation. Dean wasn't just defending himself, he was methodically dismantling everything Brynner had said. "And let's talk about authenticity," Dean said, his voice taking on just a hint of steel. "What's authentic about an actor who demands that everyone on set call him Your Majesty between takes? What's real about a man who threatens to walk off pictures if his dressing room isn't bigger than his co-stars? What's genuine about someone who has to remind people constantly how important he is?" Brynner's face had gone pale. These were stories that circulated through Hollywood, industry gossip about his difficult behavior on sets, but no one had ever confronted him with them so directly. Dean stepped closer to Brynner, still speaking in the same calm, conversational tone. "You want to know the difference between us, Yul? I've never had to tell anyone I'm a star. People either see it or they don't, and if they don't see it, telling them doesn't help." He paused, looking directly into Brynner's eyes. "But here's the most important difference. I don't need to tear down other people to feel good about myself. Success isn't a zero-sum game. There's room for everyone who's willing to do the work and treat people with respect." Dean turned to address the room, his voice carrying clearly to every corner. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the unpleasantness. Frank throws these parties so we can all enjoy each other's company, not so some of us can use them as opportunities to audition for the role of industry critic." The laughter that followed was immediate and genuine. Dean had turned Brynner's attack into entertainment, transforming humiliation into humor, changing the entire dynamic of the confrontation. But Dean wasn't finished. He turned back to Brynner, who stood frozen in the center of the room like a statue that had suddenly found itself in the wrong museum. "Yul, I'm going to give you some free advice. In this business there are 2 kinds of people, those who build things and those who tear things down. The builders last, the tear-down artists, well, they have their moment, but that moment doesn't usually last very long." Dean smiled, and for the first time all evening, it was completely genuine. I suggest you decide which kind of person you want to be, while you still have the choice." With that, Dean Martin walked away, leaving Yul Brynner standing alone in the center of Frank Sinatra's living room, surrounded by 70 of the most powerful people in Hollywood, all of whom had just watched him receive the most elegant professional destruction any of them had ever witnessed. The party continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. People clustered around Dean, congratulating him on his handling of the situation, while Brynner found himself increasingly isolated. Within 30 minutes, he had quietly left the party, claiming an early morning appointment. Frank Sinatra found Dean on the terrace, looking out over the lights of Los Angeles. "That was beautiful, Dino. Really beautiful." Dean shrugged, lighting a fresh cigarette. "Guy had it coming. You don't attack someone in their friend's house. It's bad manners. Still, you could have just punched him." Dean smiled. "Violence is for people who don't have better options, Frank. I had better options." Years later, when entertainment reporters would ask about the incident, Dean would always downplay it. Yul had a few too many drinks and said some things he probably regretted. It happens. But others who were there that night told a different story. They talked about the most elegant takedown in Hollywood history, the night Dean Martin proved that real cool wasn't about never losing your temper, it was about never needing to. Yul Brynner never publicly mentioned the incident, but those close to him said it changed him. He became less arrogant in social situations, more careful about picking fights he couldn't win. He had learned a hard lesson about the difference between commanding respect and demanding it.